share with the Indian startups that maybe can help them achieve their next $1 billion company. A couple of words about me. I'm currently the Chief Marketing Officer at Appsys, at the world's largest mobile app analytics qualitative platform. Former to that, I was the CMO at Galater, which got acquired, and currently I spend my time sitting on boards of several early to mid-stage startups. So, first of all, why Israel, right? I try to grab a couple of numbers from the last 3 months just as a sample. And these are from the last 3 numbers. So $2.5 billion raised for startups, $6.2 billion in exits. It's nice, it's not amazing, but we have to be concerned of the fact that Israel has an 8 million people population, okay? So I'll try to kind of summarize a few of the key points that I think really kind of characterizes Israeli startup, and we'll see if it's interesting. First thing, if you look at most of the Israeli startups, there's a very big focus on deep tech, and at least if not a focus on deep tech, there's a focus on getting to the market and dominating it super early. This is a key point in most Israeli technology today. So Israelis work in teams. Their idea is not as important as the team when they started with. It's usually best friends from college or whatever other round that they met in. And they find a problem that is very, very hard to solve, and they spend all of their time and energy trying to solve that problem. But another interesting thing is that they try to focus on the way they solve that issue in a deep technology way that will be very hard to replicate afterwards. Or if they don't really get to a very deep technology solution, if they see there's not a lot of competition, they focused 100% of their efforts to dominate the market very early. A very good example of that is an app, ride-sharing app that focuses on optimizing the time it takes you to get from here to there. I've learned it's much needed here in Bangalore. And basically, the way they do it is that every user of the app transmits their data, and then they're able to let you know what would be the best route to take and how much time you could effectively forecast for it to get there in an hour, in a day, in a week even, considering all the different data points. So once they're understood, it's not such an advanced technological idea. Yeah, crowdsourcing as a technology is there. They focused most of their efforts into getting as many users to the platform as possible early on, so other copycatters and competitors from different angle or attacking it from the exact same angle will have a problem replicating it. Because think about it, if you have one of these apps on your phone, you will not need another one. So this is a clear B2C race to the top solution. And they did end up being bought by Google by a little over $1 billion. So that is one thing. The second thing is probably one of my favorites, is Pareto everything. So for those of you who are not familiar with Pareto, it's also known as the 80-20 rule, which effectively means in life you can find a lot of occasions for that, but especially in growth and tech, 20% of your efforts are going to lead to 80% of your achievements and effects. And the other way around is true as well. 80% of your actions are going to only result in 20% of the mileage that you make. So understanding that deeply and really diving into that framework has many repercussions for how tech companies operate. A couple of interesting ones would be product. So there's a very known statement about product in Israel that says, if you launch your product to the market and you're proud of it, you probably launch it way too late, right? It also comes as in the form of there is such a thing called good enough. You don't have to go for perfection. Perfection is kind of a growth killer in many of the industries that we're talking about. So another kind of place where we can plug in the Pareto principle, and it really works for the Israeli startups, is in the recruitment and the growth stages. So a good example is actually Appsi, which is a very young company. It took $2.5 million in seed investment, and it became profitable without the need to raise another round of capital. So the company is fully profitable and currently valued at around $100 million. And it's all from a $2.5 million seed investment. And how did they do that? They outsourced everything we could that didn't have anything to do with the core business of what we're doing to third parties that we trusted. But it's even more than that. Every 2 weeks in Appsi, there's a sprint of growth. We look at 100% of the different tactics that can be done to achieve growth and grow the business. A lot of them look shiny and exciting. We all know how growth looks like before you actually get the data, right? And every time, every 2 weeks, all of these tactics get shortlisted. And we only do the top 20% that we feel might lead to the 80% of the results. If there are ideas that don't get this, they fall into the next round where other new ideas that come in and new inspiration come in, and they have to battle their way every time. And after a few times, some ideas don't make it, and that means they look good on paper, but we're actually never going to do it. Kind of like a bit like having, changing your closet and seeing that there are clothes that you haven't worn for many, many years, even though you kind of moved apartments, and in the end you're like, okay, this is never going to get worn or done. This is the equivalent of that. I think another key thing that really differentiates the thinking method is really diving deep and asking the hard questions onto how do the enterprise client, the big companies, or in general the SMEs that most tech companies are going for, how do they really make those decisions? So there are a few assumptions that many companies work on, which include, I would say, a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, where companies approach the VPs and the C-levels of those big companies, and they try to convince them, because if a C-level likes your product, the whole chain is going to respond positively. They could do basically whatever they want. They're a C-level. What we found is that the truth is not exactly that. I mean, if you consider convincing a C-level, in many cases, and especially in the enterprise business around the United States and Europe, they don't use the tools. They will not actually see how it works and what it does. What it may succumb to is maybe one line of numbers in the weekly, monthly, or quarterly report, right? And sometimes, because of those huge monstrosities of structures of companies, you might have situations where the VP or the C-level might not even know what the middle management or the juniors are using as technology. And if they're not sure, they might not want to introduce a new technology, because if there are some technologies being used, it might make them look disconnected. To hear we're already doing that is a good thing, but also a bad thing for a senior management to introduce a new technology into the organization. So out of that came the realization that every enterprise is very, very different in the way that they actually make decisions. And I think Israeli companies took it to the extreme. We are executing in a platform or in a framework that is currently known as account-based marketing, which is, during the last few years, have really taken on. But it basically means that if a startup is in their go-to-market stage and they are going for some particular vertical, they will actually shortlist a very specific and carefully selected list of 10, 20, 50, 100, whatever companies that they want to go into, but they will invest everything they have into getting something going with those companies. And once you start diving into particular companies, you start actually becoming an extension of that company. So you start understanding that there are different levels of seniority that actually make decisions and that will be part of your journey to get into a certain client, right? It could be the actual user, it could be the team leader, it could be the finance, it could be the legal, It could be people that have some sort of an interest to actually take over other departments, and that tool might allow them to make it a bit smoother. So there's a lot of factors, political and technical and vision-wise, that you need to take into account. But the important thing is to understand that you are actually not selling to an organization. You are selling to 5 or 10 or 15 different key players, champions, let's call them, within that organization. And when you go that thinking path, you actually understand that different people with different seniority levels and maybe different professions altogether and different wanting and needs will have a different funnel altogether. So a standard tech company, if they see they want to get into an enterprise client and they have to win over 8 stakeholder people that they research in that company, they will build 8 different acquisition funnels to get those people to get closer. Some of them, they will have very specific and relevant conversation. Some of them, they will just keep in the vicinity. So when they do make this big introduction, when they do go head on into that potential client, and that person kind of asks around the organization, hey, these guys, I'm considering them as a technology. Anybody heard of them? They will at least get, yeah, I've heard of them, I think, which seems small, but it's a very big decision. And it makes a very big difference in how the evaluation process is then going to be executed. A company that does this really well is an Israeli company called SimilarWeb, a fairly young company as well, already evaluated at around $600 million. What they do is competitive intelligence. You can think about it as having access to your competitors' Google Analytics. So you know what works for them, what converts for them, how are they growing, and what digital assets are converting best for them. And what they did is map the different users and different stakeholders around the organization that might be relevant, maybe very relevant and maybe very far. And they started conversations on totally different subjects. And it all comes down to, after a month or a couple of months or maybe a quarter, it all comes down to this 1 week where now SimilarWeb approaches that client from a lot of different angles and creates some sort of an inertia that will be almost impossible to discard. So we're not talking about some spray and pray email that you can easily not look at. There are key holders within the organization that in a certain time period, which is fairly short, all have different stakes in at least hearing about what one company has to offer. That is powerful if you're trying to move cycles fast and not keep on running, okay? Another thing that, that kind of characterizes and I think helps Israelis with opening up the international market, the European and US and Asia, of course, is asking, can it scale from a very, very early stage? This has 2 implications. One is the product versus services question. So I've found out that India has a fairly, let's call it a high supply of talented HR, and you guys are a lot of people. So you can base many of the solutions on services that are manual, but that doesn't scale as well as products. The other consideration is think about global from the first second of the initiative. It's easy for Israelis to do. We are 8 million people. No VC or angel investor will ever give money, $1, to a startup that says our market is the Israeli market, okay? So we don't even have that luxury of going to and attacking the local market. But what we do see is that when you, from day one, profile, envision, and interact with your global, European, Asian, American clients, you are pretty much already global ready. A good example for that is actually, again, an Israeli company. They call it Doric. What they do, what they started off as a UX agency and conversion optimization for commerce website. Basically a technology, but not a technology, know-how, a discipline, best practices of experts helping Israeli website commerce to monetize and get most of their clients, of their visitors, right? And then they pretty much saturated the Israeli market, which again is not that big, and they said, you know what, let's go global, that's the next big step. And they found massive, massive challenges. So what they actually do, they started asking questions on how can we now automate and productize something that was a service. That's every time that you look at a service, that's a very interesting question to ask. Yeah? And then, of course, it was at the right about the time where AI became something of importance and the technology was starting to be there. And they actually went down the AI path to replicate real people doing it in real time. And this is when they started seeing the hockey stick. Feeling comfortable with the chicken and egg stage. So every venture, even in later stages, finds themselves in situations that we can categorize as chicken and egg. Many marketplaces find the chicken and egg problem. How do you grow supply and demand and not lose one side when you have to actually maintain both of them? Or if it's an Indian company that's trying to go and get there and land their first enterprise client in the United States, how do you prove to them that you can work with enterprises because they are the first enterprise? So there's a lot of situation that you can define as such. I think what differentiates or what is very on the minds of Israeli startup is that we focus and we understand that we're going to have a lot of these. We map them in advance, and solving chicken and egg situation and stages is actually the most important part of the business plan when you pitch it. Okay? Because the angels and finance angle will expect you to surface all of those potentially problematic situations and focus on solving them rather than just solving the problem that you say that you're solving, because that's the base, that's the first step, of course. An interesting company that did that is a company called Fiverr, an Israeli marketplace to connect freelancers from all over the world with business owner or people that need those services. So again, for every kind of chicken and egg situation, there's a plethora of different strategies you can take to actually solve it. A couple of what they did, a couple of tactics of what they took is, one, they automated the supply chain or the supply side to make it look bigger than it is. So people would feel comfortable on the demand side going for it on the early stages. Other opportunities to solve a marketplace, for example, could be only building one of the sides as an email list instead of for a full-blown platform in the early stage. It can save you a lot of time and iterations in the actual product. Another one is maybe finding a huge client or a huge supply-side aggregator and then a huge side demand. So one of them is solved pretty easily instead of growing millions of people on each side, again, in the early days. So focusing on the chicken and egg is really, really something that is on our minds constantly. The other thing is focusing on partnerships at the very early stage. I mean, you can start thinking about it before you even have a product. Growing partnerships, and partnerships in general in our ecosystem, basically, if you can land them, most entrepreneurs' wet dream. Because it's basically having a lot of people, if you do it right, working for you, only being paid on commission. And the concept is to grow a different pipeline that might indeed take a bit longer to mature, but will give you a much broader scope of effect into getting a deal flow that will help you to grow. So there's a couple of main ways I see Israeli companies are doing it, and they do it again from day one, even before the product is launched. The first thing is that they find, track, engage, and put on their boards a bunch of professors, academy people, and researchers from those areas where they're involved in. That does two things. One, of course, the connections to the right people they need to know then for investment or otherwise other corporations. And the second one is that it gives that tech, which only has the tech side working for it, some sort of a research academic credibility that even though we were in 2018 and tech is in some cases year ahead of academy, still have some gravity in it when you're talking to people who come from a more, I would say, standard world, where the academy still have a big weight. The second thing is obviously looking at companies in the markets where you want to penetrate that are already collaborating with other solution providers and just beat the deal that they give them. I mean, it's as simple as it sounds, but it's only done for some reason in many startups in a later stage where you can start it to begin with because you can expect a longer cycle. A company that did that well is a company called Mobileye. What they do is it's a driver safety technology that gets put into cars. And what they did is both of those channels that I mentioned, they worked hard on the B2B aspect, the B2B to B2B aspect, actually, to get into each and every aspect of the smart driving technologies, as well as put on some professors that are very much involved within the communication and data and the transportation area. What that created is basically the company was suddenly on the radar of both big tech companies and car manufacturers. And indeed, last year, they got bought by Intel for a bit over $15 billion. So you could argue that such an advanced technology will not be able to be sold that fast if the right connection were not always in place. One of my favorite things that I think actually Israelis and Indians have a lot in common in terms of the mentality. And that is easily done, and that is to consider exotic business models. So we all know the standard business models for most mid-stage to early-stage startups. We're talking about subscription, we're talking about seats or points of data or cloud space or a one-time fee or a yearly fee or the standards, right? What I've seen work more and more for Israeli startups is actually considering a different approach to different pricing models. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is a company called Spotinst. It's a company that basically saves up until 80% of your AWS storing costs. And they only charge a certain fee or a certain percentage of what they save that client in AWS costs. So imagine the power and the credibility of an entrepreneur or a company approaching and saying, you know what, we don't want a monthly fee. We are so confident in our product's result that we're willing to only take money that we save you, only take a part of that. And that really works for them well. Another interesting deal structure that I've seen a lot across the world is what we call the 3+9. So a 3+9 is basically 3 months of a paid proof of concept, lower fee, and then a full-on 9 months that complete a year contract at the full cost of what the startup actually wants to charge. That sounds not that innovative, but actually if you look at it, it creates more confidence and removes a lot of the friction and the risk on the client side, because they say to themselves, okay, we have an exit point after 3 months. Let's see if these guys can actually deliver value. And only after that, we'll be able to pay the full price, which is kind of a win-win for both situations. And what happens then is that in that proof of concept 3 months time, that company works very, very hard to get as sticky as possible with as many stakeholders in the organization as possible. So when the 3 months time is up, it's actually hard for the client to let go of the new technology, if it's worth something. Yeah. I'd like to finish off by sharing something that I actually saw in common that both Israelis and Indians have, and that is dedication and the hard work that I've seen the startups and the ecosystem here doing in terms of pivoting when it's needed, not taking to heart, and continue with the eyes on the prize. So there's a sentence, a quote that every Israeli entrepreneur knows. It goes, you start your hardest, giving it everything you got, and then you slowly pick up the pace from there, right? So it seems like you guys are doing it big, and I'm very happy to be here. If there's any question, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to give advice. Thank you for indulging me.
Any questions from the audience?
Yes.
It was a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One of the things I've seen with Israeli startups is a very close connection between industry and academia. And we frequently see academic professors getting into the startup and back. That is not very prevalent in India. How do you think that we can bring it in?
Why would you think it's not prevalent? Is it because not many startups have the access, or is it not the way of thought?
It's partly both.
Yeah.
And I don't know the real cause for the problem, but at least you can speak from an Israeli standpoint, and how do you facilitate that?
Okay, that's an interesting angle. I would say if entrepreneurs spend maybe 5% of their resources and mental power to actually go in and break those barriers and engage with the academy, I do not see any problems with actually getting them on board. I mean, if we look at the purpose of academy, and most of the people that end up joining, the doctors and the professors and the researchers that end up joining the technology companies, it's what they chose for their lives in terms of they want to advance their knowledge in a certain area. So I really think in this case, I might be wrong, it's a matter of focus rather than inability or not unwillingness of the academy to actually come in and help. I think we just need to connect them better. Here's a startup idea, connecting Indian academy with the Indian startups. Any other questions today?
Okay.
Thank you very much.